Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, and today we are on episode 60. Goodness gracious, time has flown by. But here we are, episode 60, and we're going to talk about an important topic today. We're bringing on Marit Berchner with the Mercator Fellowship Group, and she's going to talk about what's going on down there and how they're trying to power Tanzania. And we've said it before, I'm going to say it again, getting power to people, it needs to be a discussion that we have to have. How do we do it? And I know that there's strong opinions on coal and gas and oil and renewables. I know there's a lot of strong opinions there, and I think that's part of the show is we want to talk about those things. But we have to remember that people need power too, and so she's doing it through solar. You'll hear all about it. It's a very fascinating program. She's getting ready to wrap it up, and I think she's going to come on, hopefully, again here in a couple months to kind of talk about what it's like after you've been somewhere for so long that has so little access to power, and then you come back to where power is everywhere. And so there's an interesting dynamic there as well. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Marit Berchner. Well, Merritt, thanks for joining us, especially all the way from Tanzania. It's good to have you on today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, just for the audience's benefit, we're recording this on June 26th, and kind of give us a balance because, the climate this time of year in Africa is a little bit different, in some parts at least, than it is in the States. What is the climate down there? What's the weather like in Tanzania today?
Well, we just got to the end of the rainy season, so we've had a lot of rain in May, and now it's just getting cold.
Yeah.
Cold and dusty.
And how cold does it get down in Tanzania?
In Celsius, it would be probably about 15 degrees now during the day, but it does get down to 7 or 8. I think that's in the 70s in Fahrenheit, but I'm not sure. Yeah,
not too bad. Not too bad if it's in the 70s in Fahrenheit, but still, for Africa, I'm sure that's pretty cool. Okay, so you're with the Mercator Fellow, and you work on international affairs. So what brought you into energy, and what do you do at your organization?
Okay, so what first brought me into energy, the energy sector, was an internship that I did about 4 years ago. I worked with an organization in Cameroon in West Africa, and they were providing energy access to rural villages through hydropower plants. So very small scale hydropower plants, just enough to power a village basically. And I hadn't really worked on energy before that, but I just came there because I wanted to learn more about like green economy and the whole CDM, the climate development mechanism. And so that was my first time really getting in touch with the energy sector. And I was just fascinated by what an impact it has on people's lives if they have energy or not, and just how it changes your whole daily routine depending on do you have light or not, and do you have sustainable and consistent access to light. So I kind of got stuck after that and just wanted to learn more and started then studying the same as well. I studied environmental policy and planning, focusing on energy policies and international energy policies. And so after my master's, I started as a Mercator Fellow, which means that for a year I get to work with different organizations that, I'm free to choose where I want to go and what I want to work on. And that's how I got to Tanzania.
You mentioned something there, and I think as energy professionals, sometimes we kind of lose sight of this, is that, especially here in the States where you have access to abundant energy all the time, that people don't have that. And sometimes we kind of get caught up in, how to execute this or think about this. And we kind of forget that having energy is crucially important. And it sounds kind of simple to say that, but it probably doesn't sink in until you go to a third world country where there is no energy, there's no running water. And you kind of sit back and you go, wow, just a little bit of energy makes a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely. When you look at Tanzania, only about 13% of the households are even connected to the grid. So that's a massive percentage of the population that just doesn't have any access to grid at all. So all the power they're getting will be from alternative energy sources like kerosene, or some of them do have solar or other sources that you might find.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that you are down there working on renewables. What kind of renewable projects are you working on? Is it wind or microgrid, or where are you kind of at, and what are you kind of doing?
I work for Off-Grid Electric, which is an American startup actually that's providing solar home systems. So it's very small scale. They come with appliances. So the smallest scale system has about 4 lights, and the bigger ones will also have a radio and USB charging and TVs. But it's still all very small scale and just focusing on single households.
Right. And so when an area, I'm assuming because there's such a small population that actually has power, that there's not even really an established grid. So when you think about getting power to Tanzania, it seems like renewables would be kind of the easiest and most efficient way.
Yeah, definitely. It's a huge potential that you have here. what makes it complicated is always the financing, because most people here just live on a day-to-day basis and they don't have the capital to invest in bigger systems or to even invest in solar home systems. So the way that the company I work with does this is that it goes through a leasing systems. So people will pay a certain amount a month depending on the size of their system, and then after 3 years, the system will be theirs.
Right. Now, I know that you've got renewables, and you got something that you call the water food nexus. Kind of walk us through what that is and how that ties into renewable energy.
Yeah, so I started working on the water energy food nexus before my assignment here. So in the context of the Mercator Fellowship, I first worked in South Africa with WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature. And what I did there was just looking at how do the individual sectors interconnect. Because when you look at the energy sector, we sometimes tend to just get into this silo way of thinking where it's just energy. But when you look at reality, energy is not just energy, but lots of energy sources need water. For example, coal power plants are very water intensive and nuclear is very water intensive. So everything that needs cooling will need water. And so we need to think about when we do energy planning and how do we want to develop the energy provision for a country, how does the water sector play into that? So that's one thing. And how does food tie into that? So food depends on both. So we need both water and energy to provide for food, because the agricultural sector is very water intensive, but it also needs fuel for tractors and the like. So that are ways how all the three sectors are connected, and land use would be another issue. Maybe I can tell a little story to explain that. When I was working in Cameroon, we were working on very small scale water power plants or hydropower plants. But what I saw there in some of the villages we went to was that the water that was taken by the hydropower plant had before been used by some of the farmers to irrigate their fields. So they were getting upset because they couldn't use the water in the same way they had before. And it was something that just hadn't been considered when the water power plant was planned. So just to have an awareness of how do these sectors actually interact and how do they play together is actually really important.
Okay, so a minute ago you mentioned that you just got through with the rainy season. So what is the water situation in Tanzania? Is there a lot of rivers and lakes that you have flowing and store water that you can store, or is it more of a dry land?
It depends very much on where exactly you go in the country. So where I'm based now, I'm very close to Mount Kilimanjaro actually. And there's a lot of water here, but there are some drier regions as well. And when you go further south, like South Africa, Southern Africa, then you get a lot more drier regions. And those are particularly affected by climate change as well. So they will get drier as time progresses and climate change progresses.
Okay, so you mentioned you're tying in water with food and energy. So does this encourage you to build retention ponds to store water? Or how do you make sure that you, especially in an area that's dry, that you get water and you can store it somehow? What are you doing on that phase of the project?
Well, in that phase of the project, I would mainly focus on how can we plan energy access and the energy provision or power plants in a way that will make it possible for us to provide electricity without just using too much of the water resources. So I would plan for especially big power plants, not in particularly dry regions, for example.
Right. No, it seems like it's when you look at these problems, like I was talking about earlier, especially where you have somewhere where you have only a small portion of the population's on the grid, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how do you get the rest of the population to have power? Maybe not on the grid as we would think about it in the U.S., but how do you get them to have power? And then if you brought up, there's a lot of problems. You have food, and you have water, and you have energy, and you have all these things that are connected, and then you have areas that are dry and that are more wet. It seems like it's a very vast problem that you have to solve. So when you're thinking about this, are you using some kind of advanced modeling to kind of work out your system, or are you just trying to scale it down into bite-sized chunks and saying, let me just try to solve this here, and then we'll worry about the rest later?
Yeah, I think at the moment I'm pretty much working on more the bite-sized approach, especially with the system size that I'm working with at the moment. These problems of water and food are not as relevant. So the solar home systems really are a win-win situation, I think, in that point, because they will not affect these resources, and at the same time, they will increase access to electricity and also help out with other things. Like most people here, for example, for light, they will use kerosene and kerosene lamps. So those have a lot of adverse effects on health, and having a solar system will increase the health benefits as well. So that's pretty much working on the smaller scale for now.
Right. Now, you mentioned the solar home system a couple of times now. Kind of walk us through that. When we think of that, what exactly does it entail? You kind of alluded earlier it has some appliances that it runs. How much actual power does a home get from one of these solar home systems?
So the panel size we have are pretty small. They were approximately up to 100 watts each. So they're very small, but they come with a battery that will store energy so that people who buy the system will have light available throughout the night as well. And then they just power the appliances that come with the system.
And that might sound like not a lot, but it's probably life-changing for the people there just to have access to those kind of appliances and have power for them.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, when you go to the field and actually talk to customers, it's really interesting to hear their stories. It sounds cliche, but they tell you how their kids are now able to study at night and have light, and how their grades increase in school, and how they're able to just spend the evening with the family watching TV, which they weren't able to do so before. And so it does change people's lives tremendously. And that's why I'm so passionate, I think, about this, is just seeing that the impact it actually has on people's lives is so enormous.
No, and it is. It really is. So one final kind of question for you. What has been the response of the government to this project? Are they kind of supportive? Are they kind of hands-off? Or where do they fit in with what you're trying to do down there?
They are supportive. There are certain programs that are supporting the kind of work that the company's doing. I wouldn't say not too bad.
Right. Well, it's always interesting when you go to countries where the state owns the current electrical company, and you're like, okay, well, this is kind of almost a conflict of interest for them. So we've talked on the show before about how will they integrate some of these decentralized grids into the main grid as we go along. And so it's a fascinating discussion. But regardless, you guys are doing great work down there. It's so awesome to hear. And anytime we can get folks power, that's just encouraging for me. So thank you for what you're doing. If people want to find out more about you or what you're doing, how could they do that?
Just websites. So I would, if you want to learn more about what I'm doing, it's always good to just check out on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. And the Mercator Fellowship also has a website, which I can provide the link for. And then Off-Grid also has a website. So just Google Off-Grid Electric, and then you'll find out more about our work in Tanzania. And there's also some activities in Rwanda and Ivory Coast.
Okay. Well, when do you finish up in Tanzania?
I only have a few more weeks left, actually.
Okay. Well, good. After you get back and settled in and kind of have some time to reflect on your thoughts, we'd love to hear you back to come back on and just kind of tell us, now that you've been back to Germany or wherever you're going back to, you can say, okay, now that I'm out of it, this is kind of my thoughts, and get a nice recap. Also, for the listeners, we'll link to all those websites where you can find her, the Mercator Fellowship as well, in the show notes, and so be sure to check that out. Merritt, thank you so much for coming on. Y'all are doing great work, and we just love to hear about this stuff, and hopefully we can get more people power sooner.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Merritt for coming on. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for what you're doing. It's just really good to hear people, boots on the ground, getting power to people, as that is an extremely important thing to do. Hey, if you haven't left us a review in iTunes, we would really appreciate it. Also, if you listen to the show regularly, if you could subscribe in iTunes, that would be a big help. It helps us get our reach out there. And so we have heard from several people, some guests and some listeners and some folks, they all say, hey, we appreciate what you're doing, and we want more people to hear about it. We are trying to bring you just a well-rounded thought process on the energy professionals. So we're not trying to say we're fair and balanced or this is the gold standard. We're saying we're bringing on folks from a different background and let them tell their side of the story, and we want to hear from more energy professionals. And the best way to do that is for you to subscribe and leave us a rating in iTunes. So we'd really appreciate that. The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R2 Global.